Most killers deny everything. They lie, they deflect, they sit across from investigators and cling to silence as if it can still save them, as if the truth hasn't already left a trail behind them. But every so often, someone does the unthinkable. They confess, not after hours of pressure, not when the evidence closes in, but almost immediately, almost willingly. And what they say in those moments has a way of staying with the people who hear it for the rest of their lives. One detective would later admit he could still hear the man's voice years after the case was closed, steady, calm, almost relieved, as if he had been waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. And when that question came, he didn't hesitate. He leaned forward, looked directly across the table, and began to speak, not just about what he had done, but how long he had been thinking about it, how carefully he had planned it, and how strangely easy it had felt in the moment it happened. And that is the part that unsettled everyone in the room, because there was no anger in his voice, no panic, no trace of regret, just a quiet certainty that what he was saying needed to be heard. And as the recording continued, the details became harder to ignore, each sentence revealing something more precise, more calculated, more difficult to understand, until it was clear that this was not just a confession. It was a window into a mind that no one in that room could fully comprehend. And tonight, you're about to hear confessions like that, words that didn't just close cases, but changed the people who heard them, stories where the truth didn't bring comfort, it only raised more questions. And before we go any further, before we uncover what was said in those rooms and why it still matters today, before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What makes someone admit everything even when they don't have to, when the room is quiet, when the evidence is still being pieced together, when there is still a chance to walk away from the truth and let the system struggle to prove what really happened? What is it that shifts inside a person like the man from earlier, the one who leaned forward without hesitation and began to speak as though he had been waiting for that exact moment? Because in cases like his, the confession doesn't feel forced, it feels chosen. And that is what unsettles investigators the most, the idea that somewhere along the line, the silence became heavier than the consequences. And then there is the question that lingers long after the recording ends. Why do some killers want to be heard? Why do they describe details no one asked for? Why do they continue talking even when the room has already gone still? As if the act itself was only part of the story and the telling of it is something just as important. And in one particular case, one that would leave even experienced detectives searching for answers, the confession did something no one expected. It didn't bring clarity. It didn't close the investigation. Instead, it introduced a possibility that had never even been considered, something that forced everyone in that room to rethink what they thought they understood, because sometimes the most chilling part isn't the crime. It's the moment the truth begins to unfold, piece by piece, in a way no one is prepared for. The man sitting across that table would later be identified in reports as Michael Carter, a name that, up until that night, meant very little to anyone outside his quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where people waved from their driveways and trusted that the person living next door was exactly who they appeared to be. Michael fit that image perfectly, a steady routine, a modest home, family photos lining the walls, the kind of life that never draws attention, which is why when investigators first brought him in, it was meant to be a conversation, nothing more, a chance to clear up a few details, a formality in a case that still had too many unanswered questions. But something shifted the moment he sat down, something subtle that no one in the room could quite explain later, because before a single piece of evidence was presented, before the questions could even take shape, Michael leaned forward, his hands steady, his voice calm in a way that didn't match the weight of the moment. And he said he was ready to talk. Not cautiously, not defensively, but with a kind of quiet acceptance that immediately changed the direction of everything that followed. And when he began, it wasn't scattered or uncertain. It was structured, deliberate, almost rehearsed, as if he had gone over it in his mind again and again, each detail placed exactly where it needed to be. He described the night with precision, the timing, the choices, the small decisions that led to something irreversible. And as the minutes passed, the room grew heavier, not because they were uncovering what happened, but because of how clearly he seemed to understand it all. There were no gaps, No confusion, no attempts to soften what he had done, just a steady unfolding of events that painted a picture far more controlled than anyone had anticipated. And that was the moment investigators began to exchange glances, the kind that didn't need words, because what they were hearing didn't sound like a man recounting a single mistake. It sounded like someone who had done this before, someone who had thought about it long before that night ever came. And as Michael continued speaking, adding details no one had asked for, clarifying moments that had not yet been questioned, it became impossible to ignore the growing realization settling over the room. This wasn't just a confession meant to close a case. It was the beginning of something much larger, something that suggested the story they thought they were investigating might only be one part of a pattern they had yet to fully uncover. In another case, far removed from Michael Carter's quiet neighborhood and controlled confession, investigators found themselves facing someone who reacted in a way that felt even harder to process. A man later identified as Ryan Mitchell, who from the moment he entered the room carried none of the tension they had come to expect. No shaking hands, no restless movements, no visible effort to hold himself together. Instead, there was a stillness about him, the kind that draws attention because it feels out of place. And as the questioning began, he didn't interrupt, didn't object, he simply listened. And then, at a moment when most suspects begin to resist or retreat, Ryan did something that immediately unsettled everyone watching. He smiled, not broadly, not in a way that could be easily explained away, but just enough to make it clear that something about the situation did not affect him the way it should have. And when the question was finally asked, why, there was a brief silence. The kind that usually signals hesitation, but what followed was anything but uncertain. His answer came calmly, almost casually, as if he were explaining a routine decision. And he didn't stop there, he continued, laying out each detail with a level of clarity that removed any doubt about what had happened, his tone never rising, never breaking, each word delivered with the same steady rhythm, as though he were describing events that belonged to someone else entirely. And as the minutes passed, the room grew heavier, not because of what was being revealed, but because of how little emotion accompanied it. One of the officers present would later recall that it was in that moment he understood they were facing something different, something that didn't follow the patterns they had trained for, because there was no sign of conflict in Ryan's voice, no indication that he was struggling with what he had done, just a quiet acceptance paired with a willingness to explain it all in full. And even as the recording continued, even as the questions became more direct, his demeanor never shifted, which made what came at the very end even more difficult to comprehend, because just when it seemed like he had already said everything that mattered, he added one final detail, something no one in that room had anticipated, something that would change the way the entire confession was understood moving forward. And then there was this case, one that investigators would later describe as the moment everything they thought they understood about confessions began to shift, because unlike Michael Carter, who spoke with careful structure, or Ryan Mitchell, whose calm delivery unsettled the room, this case unfolded in a way no one had prepared for. The suspect, identified as Ethan Walker, had already admitted to the crime. The statement was clear, detailed, and enough to bring the investigation to what should have been its final stage. Reports were being drafted, timelines were aligning, and for a brief moment, it seemed like the process had followed a familiar path, a confession leading to closure. But as Ethan continued speaking, something changed, his tone lowered slightly, his words slowing just enough to draw attention. And then he added a detail that didn't fit with anything investigators had established up to that point. He said he wasn't alone, and at first, it sounded like an attempt to shift responsibility, something detectives encounter often, a last effort to share the weight of what had been done. But the way he said it, the certainty behind it, made it difficult to dismiss, because he didn't hesitate, didn't correct himself. He continued as though this had always been part of the story, describing movements, timing, and interactions that suggested another presence. Another set of decisions unfolding alongside his own. And as those details began to take shape, the room that had once felt settled grew tense again. Investigators exchanging looks as the realization set in that this confession wasn't closing anything, it was expanding it. And suddenly the evidence they thought they understood needed to be re-examined, every timeline reconsidered, every assumption questioned. Because if what Ethan was saying was true, then the case they believed was complete was only the beginning of something far more complex, something that extended beyond a single person and into a possibility they had not yet accounted for. And in that moment, the sense of resolution disappeared entirely, replaced by a new and far more unsettling question, not just about what had happened, but about who else might have been involved all along. Confessions are supposed to bring truth, closure, justice. They are meant to mark the point where uncertainty ends and the full weight of what happened can finally be understood. But when you listen to cases like Michael Carter, Ryan Mitchell, and Ethan Walker, that idea begins to feel far less certain, because instead of clarity, what their words revealed was something far more difficult to process. Michael's careful timeline raised questions about how long his actions had been forming. Ryan's calm, almost detached explanation forced investigators to confront a complete absence of emotion where it should have been impossible to ignore, and Ethan's final statement turned what should have been a closed case into something unfinished, something that continued to unfold even after the confession had been given. And when you place these moments side by side, a pattern begins to emerge, not in what they did, but in how they chose to speak about it. The ease, the willingness, the lack of hesitation. It challenges the assumption that truth always brings resolution, because in these cases, it did the opposite. It expanded the unknown. It left investigators with more to question than they had before, and that is what stays with the people who heard it. Not just the details of the crimes, but the realization that the most unsettling part was never hidden. It was spoken aloud, clearly, calmly, and without resistance, because in the end, the scariest part isn't what they did, it's how easily they talked about it. Now that you've heard how Michael Carter spoke with such careful control, how Ryan Mitchell showed no trace of emotion, and how Ethan Walker turned a closed case into something far more uncertain, the question becomes harder to ignore. Which of these confessions stayed with you the most? Which one felt the most real? And do you believe any of them truly revealed everything? Or is there still something missing beneath the surface that was never said? Because sometimes what's left out can be just as important as what's spoken. And if these stories made you question what a confession really means, make sure you subscribe, because the next story will take this even further and reveal something you won't be able to forget.